Okay, so yeah, thank you to everyone who gave talks in this session. That's been really helpful. So what I want to do for the rest of the time, I think we have about a half hour here, is to do sort of a town hall kind of session and answer any questions you all have and get feedback on what our plans are for this first iteration of the Cryptoeconomic Systems journal. So we already have our call for papers out. So you can read about some of what our plans and structure are in the call for papers that's already available. You also get to see the program committee, many of you here who have already committed to review papers for this iteration. And there's also the timeline here are the key dates, so you can see roughly the constraints that we're working on. So I wanted to go into a little bit more detail and what some of the parameters are that we can still change as well. So first of all, just to recap what I think are the high-level goals that we're trying to achieve with the journal, and that should then be served by the reviewing structure that we're going to have. So first of all, I think our top-level goal, especially for this first iteration, is field building. So this isn't, we, for example, don't want to get lost in an experiment of too much technical detail. Really what we want to do is people-oriented and building the trust and mutual understanding across our different disciplines and collaboration between us. So that is, I think, first and foremost our focus of what we're trying to achieve. All right, our overall goal for the journal is to improve the quality and the signal-to-noise ratio of the kind of writing that is done about the innovative research that's taking place in the cryptocurrency ecosystem. So we think in particular that a lot of the interesting work that's done from outside the traditional academic universities, all right, is actually really quality innovation, but would benefit from going through a somewhat more structured peer review process. And so that's what we're trying to achieve through a journal. All right, and it's an explicit part of our goal with this is to actually do experimentation in how blockchains or tokenization could help the peer review process and address some of the limitations or scaling problems of what we see in academia. So what I want to get out of this discussion is we can talk about the long-term goals, but also about the short-term goals. So we have now a timeline set. Papers are going to show up in our boxes by October 22nd, and we're going to have to start reviewing them over the next couple of months. So Itai asked about is revolution versus evolution. This particular case is going to be evolution. So what we're going to do is start with a very modest experiment. It's really hardly an experiment at all. We're going to do something that's mostly in the form of what we already have experience with in computer science and in computer security. So we're going to try to role model the peer review process mostly with a program committee chosen from professional academics and people who we know and have already worked with in some way as engineers or contributors in open source. So while our overall timeline is set, the main dimension where we still have some degree to experiment even now and where your feedback right now would be really helpful to us is to modify what is exactly the structure of the reviews that we're asking reviewers to complete and what goes into the instructions for reviewers. So I want to give just a couple of examples of what I have in mind, starting with, I like to go over high-level principles. It's a little vague and fuzzy, but the reason is that sometimes if you want to disagree with something or pose an idea, you can refer to a particular principle that we probably would all agree. I think the top one from my point of view is to have respect for the reviewer's attention. All right, reviewers put a lot of effort as volunteers into the reviewing, and I hate to see it squandered in any way, so that's always at the top of my mind. Something that I've noticed in the computer security community is an active effort by program chairs to remind reviewers to be constructive. And as the recipient of sometimes really angry reviews, I appreciate the value that goes into being constructive. I think when it's working well, the peer review process is really an excellent form for giving constructive feedback that helps everyone do better work, when it's working well. So while there's a gatekeeping element and trying to keep things high quality, I think really we should be focusing on the constructive value add of the peer review process. I won't go over all of these. I think substance over form is an important aspect for our goals at appealing to multiple disciplines. So I don't expect that in this journal we're going to get everyone to make exactly the same formatting guidelines. I think it would be hopeless to try. And so we're going to focus our efforts on having substantive, constructive reviews and be tolerant of possibly differing formats as we get papers in from people with different academic backgrounds. All right, so yeah, to recap, right, the kind of timeline that we have is roughly like a couple of months period during which we'll do the reviews collection and have the discussions among the reviews. So this is especially relevant for if you're not already in the computer science or the computer security community, and in particular if you're in somewhere that does journals. The way that we do it in computer science is mostly like this structure, and it has a couple of good elements. So one is that unlike in a journal format where papers show up at any time and then get dispatched by an editor to reviewers based on who the editor knows or who the authors of the paper recommend, this is sort of front-loaded. So that whole list of program committee members are people who have already agreed to show up at a certain time, I mean, virtually show up, but they've already committed to put in the effort to reviewing some papers. I think we set like a maximum, like we're not gonna make you review more than the, I don't know, 6 to 10 or whatever it says on the call for papers is some reasonable limit, but we sort of front-loaded the process of getting people to agree to review, so that should cut down on the turnaround time of people saying, no, I'm not available to review. We have kind of the facility through the Hot Crap software to do automated reviewer assignment. So reviewing, this is essentially a blockchain, right? So papers get submitted to the online reviewing system. They then get broken up into sharded committees, right? So each paper will get reviewed from around 3 reviewers, right? It's some combination of randomness with bias from the editors and load balancing across different folks in different communities. Reviewing the way that it typically works with computer science is really triple blind review, so meaning the authors don't know who the reviewers are, the reviewers don't see the names of the authors, the reviewers also don't see each other, at least initially. So there's basically a couple of phases. In the first phase, you don't see who the other reviewers are and you write your review on your own. And then the second phase, it's really valuable. You get to see who the other reviewers are and you get to see their reviews. And this provides a kind of calibration. Like if you're totally off base, you get to discuss it with the other reviewers. This is a really important mechanism for learning how the review process works. So if you're not an apprentice PhD student who learns the peer review process from your advisor, I think there's actually some hope that you'll learn the conventions of peer review just by seeing what the other peer reviewers do and being able to discuss with them in the comments. So roughly the goal is for the review shard for each paper to reach a consensus decision on what to say about it before the author notification deadline. Something I'm interested in is, as most conferences now have a shepherding process, like a conditional accept, if not a revise and resubmit or reject and resubmit, which is roughly how much extra work you're supposed to do to get another chance at getting the paper accepted. I think given our timeline, we don't really have too much ability to do that, but one option is potentially to have like working papers that go to the conference, even if they are really conditionally accept to be included in the proceedings after the fact. There's a little bit of wiggle room still that we could discuss. I want to go over 3 ideas which are, I think, the only things that we're doing that are really like I don't know, innovative or slightly different. So the first one is in keeping with the idea that this is meant to be an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary building. In order to seed the review discussions with diversity, we're going to make sure that there's at least one sort of outsider to the paper's natural field, or at least some representative from 2 different disciplines show up to discuss each paper. So this may mean if you're a reviewer that you're asked to chime in on the discussion about a paper completely outside your area. Hopefully you learn and contribute something and we make some progress that way. So that's one. So the second one, so we want to make an open peer review process. So this can mean that we publish a summary of the reviews after the fact. This is tricky because the downside of having open peer reviews is maybe you'll hold back on your honest criticism if you know that what you're going to write is going to be published. I think that there are trade-offs there. What I want to suggest that I think addresses keeping this in line with focusing on constructive is what I want to include in the instructions to reviewers is that the review shard for each paper should be collaborating in the comments section on a summary that will be published alongside each accepted paper, which should serve as like a forward to the paper from the reviewers, which could serve to either explain the contribution of the paper in other words, serve as like an introduction to the paper or a translation of it to a different audience's terminology, something of supplemental value that focuses on the constructive value of the review process. By publishing something about the review process, my hope is that this is how we will be making some visibility into how the peer review process works to people who aren't already in academia and know how it works. So this is going to also serve the purpose of making the process a little bit more visible and then encouraging more people to participate later. I thought that Itai's comments about from the first talk right here on trying to preserve the high standards of quality and rigor that each field develops on its own. These take different forms, like in cryptography, it's theory and proofs. In systems, it's like controlled, diligent benchmark evaluations. So I think in non-sciences, there's still some component of validation, like case studies, for example. I don't understand the ones outside of computer science as well, but hope to learn from you all. But what I think we agree on is that all of peer review and rigorous analysis involves some sort of aspect of validation that's expected to show up in the papers. So without going into too much detail about what the peer review structured comments are like, I think what we'll include is a validation form in which you can say what effort the paper took to provide its own validation and what would be the standards expected from the highest quality work in the respective fields. That's all that I wanted to say right now on what this policy is going to be. So what I want to do is turn it over to questions. I mean, there's a bunch that I can suggest that we could talk about in terms of feedback about this policy, what else you would have or like to include. What I understand the best is the computer science process, and so that's why we are starting with a structure that's most similar to the way that computer science reviews are done. But the goal is to make something that is appreciated and sort of tolerable, at least, to all of your respective fields. So anything that we could do that would help that goal along, I would be really interested in hearing about. So yeah, that's all. Now, I guess take questions. I feel like this is like a stage, and I want to just have like town hall. So I'm going to sit here with a pen, and I may just redirect questions to Wasim and Neha as well to help me discuss this.
Can you imagine building in improvements over time? So, for example, you decide that there's a key performance or some key performance indicators, and then on an annual basis, somebody takes a decision that now we need to tweak something.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking in some case about this first iteration, which has time set, but the hope is to make this an annual event for which we should iterate a little bit each time. And my hope would be even in the second year we can be much more experimental and change things a lot. I think performance metrics is a really good question. So one thing that I had in mind for feedback to get after the fact, it's good to have measurable goals to, if I'm going to call it an experiment, we should check something, observations after. I don't have a totally clear vision of what that should be. So what I have in mind is to basically poll authors after the fact to ask whether or not they found the reviews were constructive and helpful to them. Another idea could be to poll other experts besides the ones who are in our program committee to check whether or not they agree that the reviews reflect high quality standards for appropriate fields.
So first, a logistical suggestion, and then I'll ask my question. But maybe it might make sense for us to stop using mics and actually just all kind of come here and sit around, because otherwise it feels like a very... I know, maybe it won't go on the recording. But just to have more of a discussion. However, we only have 9 minutes left and there's a break, so maybe it's not worth it, but we could employ this later. And second, so I think that Brian, made the claim proof of stake doesn't work. We've proved it doesn't work. I think that there are a lot of people who would disagree with that. And, it's interesting to see this, amongst people who are very intelligent, who have a lot of experience, who who are smart people. It's not just that one side's right, one side's wrong. There's some kind of failure happening here. I don't know if it's a failure to communicate, if it's a failure to define terms properly, or if it's, and I don't want to use such a negative word as failure, but I think this is part of what this journal is supposed to help with, is how do we get to a common set of axioms and acceptable methodology and ideas of what is fact and what is not fact, because it feels a little bit broken right now. So I'm curious if anyone else has any ideas about that.
Anyone want to respond to that? Raise your hand if you want to specifically respond to that. I'm assuming Bob will.
I can sort of, I want to say something related, but I can sort of specifically respond to that. Proof of stake in particular, right, kind of rests on a circular argument, right? I had consensus at the last block, and therefore I can create consensus on the next block. This is a proof by induction, and if I go back, everything was decided at the genesis block, right? So this is a logical fallacy, and if you build a paper built on a logical fallacy, you're just straight out flat wrong, right? Done, go home. And so...
Are you saying proof by induction is a logical fallacy, or that the...
Well, no, the notion that this is a distributed system is false, right? Because everything was decided at the genesis block. I decided the set of validators at the genesis block, and they decide the next set of validators. There are several circular arguments within proof of stake. Another one is the stake itself, right? So I start on day 0, I don't have anything that's worth anything. Everything's worth 0, right? And then I want to take that set of things, which are all value 0, I want to perform a maximization process over them. Maximization over a set of things which are all worth 0 is 0, right? So you have to add to that something which causes it to be worth something in the first place. And a bunch of speculators on a market is a zero-sum game. So it's still 0. Anyway, so this is one example. And whether you agree with me or not, I'm sure plenty of people in the audience disagree with me. But regardless of that, what I wanted to share was my experience with a previous journal in this space along these lines. So for a time, I was an editor for the Ledger Journal, which was kind of the previous experiment on this. And what I observed is that the quality of submissions were absolutely abysmal. And so why is that? Why are they so abysmal? I think that this community, I hope, has more people from kind of a distributed systems and cryptography background, and we'll get more submissions from kind of that perspective. What we had coming into the Ledger Journal was dominantly people from like an economics background who just completely misunderstood a lot of things. And you know, so in physics there's a phrase, not even wrong, which is something I would apply to a lot of the submissions we had there. This is a famous phrase going back to Wolfgang Pauli that, you know, this is just so misunderstood that I can't even make heads or tails of this, right? So I agree with absolutely everything on your slides. It's absolutely wonderful. The one point you put on there was to be constructive. There's a point at which something is just so horribly misunderstood or based upon logical fallacies where you've really got to put your foot down and say, no, this is just wrong, and we have to reject it. And there's not really anything, you can't like constructively get somebody out of a logical circular argument, right? So anyway, I hope that this journal can do better than that, have better submissions.
You know, I appreciate the comments. I would say that, you know, people in the cryptography and distributed systems communities are working on, you know, things involving proof of stake. So I think that it would take a stronger argument against the existence of a proof of stake paper than simply saying it's fundamentally circular. All right.
So I've edited a journal called the Economics Bulletin since 2001. It's the oldest open access journal in economics as far as I'm aware. And we were focused on letters, short papers, 7 pages or less. And the original intention was that the standard would be, a paper should be correct, original, and of interest at least to a specialist. And we would be up or down, no revisions. Didn't work. Sociology is too strong in the profession that you have to write a review and you have to improve somebody's paper and so forth. So I'm really ambivalent, actually, about the process of improving somebody's paper. I think part of it is actually a violation of free speech. So if you have something to say, and it's correct, and it's original, and it's you know, of interest to somebody, why is it that I should take the reviewer's view of what's more interesting in some related field or something that's close? So there's been a real tendency in economics, at least, for reviewers to believe it's their role to write part of the paper for the author, and I think that's a very bad trend. So I would encourage a light touch, I guess, and let people say what they want as long as it's not nonsense.
Those are good points. I mean, one thing that I would say is also, so in focusing on the value add, I think the phrase overlay journal has been used in a couple of places. So first of all, our publishing agreement with MIT Press is diamond open access, which means authors don't pay anything, reviewers don't pay anything. It's expected that, I mean, I think the electronic distribution problem has been solved. You can upload your paper to ePrint or to archive. We expect that and tolerate that. I mean, tolerate and furthermore expect that. So certainly you don't need our review process to publish your work. And some communities are dealing with like the concern that publishing on archive may tamper with the intended good effects of the double-blind system. But trying to say you can't publish on archive your own, you know, is it makes no sense in this context, especially with the standards of open source and cryptocurrencies. So I mean, at most, if the reviewers who you're asking for feedback either give negative feedback or say we don't want to publish the review about your paper, then I don't know what can be done at that. But at least one mitigation against I at least think that no concern about limitation of free speech should show up in this because it's expected you can publish online in other ways if you choose.
Hi, a question. What do you think can be the collaboration from industry to the journal? do you expect like wish lists or problems or use cases, or how can the industry actually collaborate to the journal?
It's a good question. So, I mean, we have some members from industry specifically on our program committee and expect to include others. One thing that I think is tricky is the incentives involving industry participants. So as professional academics, it's an explicit part of our job description to spend some of our time reviewing papers on committees. It's like the service portion of our explicit job description. For anyone in industry, they'd be doing it sort of against the bottom line of their employer, and so I'm not sure where the resources would come from. I like the idea of experimenting with something where reviewers actually get income, like they get tokens or, a reward that could actually offset, the bottom line of the time that they're taking away from their productive company. I don't have an idea of how that would work out. We have nothing along those lines for this initial version. As for the other ideas that I think you're saying, like industry could, besides participating, also contribute like ideas or wish lists or bounties? I don't know. That's a good question. You have any idea?
Yeah, I would say, I think that it depends on what you mean when you say industry, but in this field, I've never seen so many people in companies doing research.
Yeah.
There's a lot of research happening outside academia. And I think we tried to create a program committee and a board and a process that creates, that treats industry as an equal partner to academia. So I work in systems, and you'll see large companies publishing in systems conferences quite frequently, and there's a nice sort of mix there.
So I'm on the journal advisory board, and I assume many perhaps people here in the audience are on the somehow involved on the program committee or and so forth. I thought we might spend a minute or two fleshing out how we view, the policy regarding overlap with any other modes of publication and submissions. So this is a journal, but it's also got an event associated with it. So can we, can people submit surveys or best of, their work that was previously published? What should be the delta over previously published work? What about simultaneous submission or something that has been submitted in a conference and now you want a journal publication? If you could spend a few minutes discussing that.
So I have a clear preference for what I would like to see from this, but it may be difficult to achieve exactly this. So what I would like to have is optional concurrent submission. So what I would like, and that's what's meant by that's even more specifically what meant by an overlay journal. So what I would like to see is that you can submit to our paper, to our journal, even if you are also submitting to a different venue. If you do that, mostly in order to be compatible with the other venue's requirements, you should opt out of having your paper published in our proceedings. What we would be able to do is still include a publication. We would still be able to include our review summary about the paper and then a link to wherever else it shows up. So I'd like to be able to do this for the sake of being able to get more income of great papers that would go through our process in addition to other processes that are there. I think that that's a viable way of bootstrapping a new effort and getting top quality there. So it's not a have to choose between ours or CCS or something. And to some degree, that's also a question of will the other venues, accept that, or will they be, I think it's fundamentally that policy of non-double submission is like a denial of service mitigation, right? You don't want to sap all of the reviewers' time by multicasting to, all of the ones. But if we're a new effort, then I think it's reasonable to, for us to tolerate that, but not to project it on everyone else, if that makes sense. Do you have it? I think that's implementable to the sense that we can say that you have the option of not having your paper included in the proceedings, and my understanding is that that's adequate to not tick off other venues.
So it sounds, I'm way in the back.
Thank you.
It sounds as if this academic journal so far is being modeled on traditional academic journals with theoretical papers looking ahead, right? Pushing the research frontier. And when I think about cryptocurrency and the blockchain projects, and if you're the Andrew Miller, I think you are, then there's a real value in disclosure of what has gone wrong. And I don't know where that would be placed. Sometimes I'm appalled that these disclosures are held quiet for so long, and maybe it's just an ethics issue about that. But do you have any thoughts about whether that would be part of your mission?
So disclosures of what's gone wrong, are you talking about like vulnerability disclosures? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you also rephrase then again, what do you have in mind? And you said, first of all, you said theoretical. I mean, I would say that we're modeled after both theoretical and systems. That's still narrow, and I'm acknowledging that it's not covering humanities, for example, even though it's not my background, but it's what we hope to, include here. But I think the point that you're making is not about like theory versus systems or theory versus applied,
but it's more like theory versus negative results.
I see.
And the value of people knowing what has gone wrong, or there's security gaps in certain protocols that have been developed, which is my personal interest.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of papers are successfully accepted to venues in computer security on the basis of attacks. So attack papers pointing out, vulnerabilities. So you can get points for that even in traditional venues. I would expect those to be on topic for our venue as well. So those are not even negative results. They're affirmative results in the category of attack papers. Another related thing, which maybe you're also interested in, is negative results, and that is when you attempt a research project, it fails. Everything you did didn't work, so and all of your benchmarks show your mechanism is worse than everyone else's, so that makes it very difficult to publish. Yeah, please. You want to talk into mine? No. Everyone says okay. Yeah, and then we have to go.
Yeah, so my initial academic training was in chemistry and physics, and in chemistry often people spend months, years preparing synthetic pathways to complex natural products, anti-cancer compounds and so on. So the chance of success on some of those synthetic pathways is very low, but very often negative results, people don't publish them. It's not considered to be impactful. And so there's a new movement called registered reports. I don't know if you're aware of this. This is kind of chemistry and biology, at least the origins are there. But I think there's some interesting lessons that we might be able to learn, where people basically commit. It's like a commitment to the research you're about to do, the experiment design and the hypothesis. And then, you can't then fiddle with it as it doesn't work. So at least there's some kind of reporting and there's some kind of pseudo-publication of negative results or, inverted commas, failures. So at least that enters the body of record, and it's less of a kind of a waste of experimental and researcher time retracing the same steps for something that may well be not possible or not viable or not feasible.
Yeah, that's good. I have to cut us off due to time, and we're into the break now. So thank you for all the discussion so far. I would love to talk with you more, so please catch me during the break, as well as Neha and Wasim. So yeah, thank you all.